Bien. Pregunta.
Is it being shared now? Okay. Okay. So let me start. Yeah. So my lecture will be sort of multilingual. This has been a very multilingual meeting, and the title somehow reflects a little bit of how it will work. It's called Combatir la nada, Combattre le néant, fighting emptiness. I was reflecting a little bit on the title of this because it sounds a little bit like this terminology coming from war, you know, combating, fighting. However, you will see that the reason I put this title is totally different. So, pour commencer, let me just say, thanks to Mirna, my sister of adventures, and I say sister of adventures because we share a common doctoral advisor and postdoctoral mentor. That doesn't happen that often. An advisor, Ken Kunin in Madison, who always let us explore our own thoughts, who clarified the picture when the time to visit his office came, but who never framed too much any of our projects. And that postdoctoral mentor, Saharon Shela in Jerusalem, whose work has opened the keys to whole areas of mathematics, for those of you who don't know, and whose absolute encouragement to pursue our most free dreams is in a mysterious way behind all our connections to other pursuits of knowledge. So thank you, Mirna. So this will have, 5 parts. They will be different from one another. And I will be reading in English and writing some things in Spanish, as you will see. So, as I said before, I will speak mostly in English, but there will be some excerpts in Spanish and a bit in French. I will also try to allow images to speak for themselves while I blurb my words. Throughout several lectures this week, time has been a central character. Looking at the past, to earlier crises, to Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, of course, to the Cold War, to the 2 world wars of the 20th century, to earlier pandemics, Justinian's plague, the 14th century plague, all the way back to geological epochs and continental drifts, as in Jan Svicky's presentation. I propose now, for a change and for contrast, a momentary look at an era of enormous optimism, an era of wide opening for society, an era when previous constraints seemed to be shed, the 1960s. I was myself born in 1968. I consider myself the child of a momentous era that now seems getting to its own closure. A movie of 1965 that grasps the optimism, the aura of possibilities, but also the enormous irresponsibility of those youths, is Michelangelo Antonioni's Blowup. I want to draw attention to 2 elements of that movie that will help me frame 2 later topics. The role of photography in effacing nothingness, in reducing the effect of forgetfulness, and the strong analogies with the role of mathematical logic, to which I want to come back later. In his movie, Antonioni depicts London's obsession with fashion and photography in an engrossing way, pleasurable to look at these days, if only for the contrast it offers to our own confinement and reduction. But at the heart of the movie is a seed of darkness, a core of discontent, an enigma to be resolved. The enigma itself, some killing in some London field, is irrelevant to our discussion today. What is important is the method, the way the young and until then vapid photographer starts using techniques of enlargement, of enhancement, of shadowing and lighting, of augmenting and effacing noise, of blowing up until he finds reality is rooted on a much thinner ice than had yet been appear. Behind the enormous optimism of the 1960s, there was a core of thin ice, of melting icebergs, that back then needed perhaps the vision of an Antonioni, of a Julio Cortázar, to be blown up large enough to be made visible. Now, the movie by Antonioni is loosely based on Julio Cortázar's short story, Las Babas del Diablo, another short story by Julio Cortázar Casa Tomada was mentioned by Carlos Cardona in the question session just a few minutes ago. So I will read an excerpt from Las Babas del Diablo, the Devil's Saliva. It means, this one here I read in Spanish, but it is projected for you in English, the excerpt. Entre las muchas maneras de combatir la nada, una de las mejores es sacar fotografías, actividad que debería enseñarse tempranamente a los niños, pues exige disciplina, educación estética, buen ojo y dedos seguros. No se trata de estar acechando la mentira como cualquier reporter y atrapar la estúpida silueta del personajón que sale del número 10 de Downing Street, pero de todas maneras, cuando se anda con la cámara, hay como el deber de estar atento, de no perder ese brusco y delicioso rebote de un rayo de sol en una vieja piedra, o la carrera a trenzas al aire de una chiquilla que vuelve con el pan o una botella de leche. Michel sabía que el fotógrafo opera siempre como una permutación de su manera personal de ver el mundo por otra que la cámara le impone insidiosa. Ahora pasa una gran nube casi negra, pero no desconfiaba, sabedor de que le bastaba salir sin la contax para recuperar el tono distraído, la visión sin encuadre, la luz sin diafragma, ni 1:250. I continue a little bit, this part, just few, bear with me in Spanish a little bit. Ahora mismo, qué palabra, ahora qué estúpida mentira, podía quedarme sentado en el pretil sobre el río, mirando pasar las pinazas negras y rojas, sin que se me ocurriera pensar fotográficamente las escenas, nada más que dejándome ir en el dejarse ir de las cosas, corriendo inmóvil con el tiempo. Y ya no soplaba viento. So this short story frames the movie that Antonioni made into Blowup that I was describing right before. Let me just say that I mentioned that I read this excerpt to my students of an introductory set theory course at the very beginning of a 2-hour session a few weeks ago. Because of the first sentence, fighting nothingness, combatir la nada, which seemed a little bit like a metaphor of part of what we are going through. Fighting nothingness, combatir la nada, seemed an adept concept. Fighting nothingness was also a metaphor for our situation, our confinement back then in class. Now, we switch to number 2. So this, before switching to number 2, this was also part of a blog with photographs that you may be seeing. I don't know if this is updating in a good time.
Sí.
Logic and probing the world. A very interesting comparison has been made here between statistical methods to probe the world and other methods, astrological, to probe the world in search of an explanation. Mirna Jamunia has extended this comparison in one of her remarks to the existence of discrete models, continuous methods, and logic. I would like to expand slightly on this. I believe Mirna and Fernando will expand on this question later as well, by merely illustrating the analogy between Antonioni's blowing up method for revealing the hidden core, the hidden structurally rotten situation, with the outwardly bright 60s, with what we do in mathematical logic. In mathematical logic, we use language, although there are many possibilities on the choice and format of that language, to, as it were, probe the world, frame the sort of questions we are interested in exploring from a given structure, be it the SIR model of epidemiology, the real numbers, the structure of exponentiation in the complex numbers, whatever. The 20th century saw the rise and literal explosion of the methods of mathematical logic, mostly obtained when one fixed language and a fixed syntax and semantics were used. It saw both the extreme rise of mathematical logic methods and of theorems proving its own limitations. Late 20th century, and even more so, our 21st century, seem to be witnessing the beginning of a new fusion, an extremely interesting rapprochement between ideas coming from geometry, especially from Grothendieck's advanced version, and logic, in forms that are still emerging, but which, dare I say, will provide a much stronger grip on logic's original intent of grasping the world, of probing the world. Salamea has asked whether peripheral view or perspective brought about by physical, geographical periphery may be, in a way, sensed in the wealth of non-classical logics. This is a difficult question to answer, but in my view, extremely important. Yet, a perhaps even tougher challenge is yet to be met by mathematical logic, if we are to believe the words of the late mathematician and philosopher Giancarlo Rota. So now we turn to the challenge to logic. So this challenge to logic is here described in Spanish, somewhat in detail, and I will read in English. In the mid-1990s, Giancarlo Rota asked a mysterious question in the form of a challenge for mathematical logicians. Find the right logic for the relation of Fundierung. I will avoid a detailed description of the technical term here, of course, but let me mention it deals with the dependence of our notions in the support in the world. So it would have something to do with dependence logic that was discussed on Monday by Jouko Vanhanen, but it has some connection to that, but it is a different question. It is also connected to time, as you will see. One of the origins, so now I begin to read what is now in Spanish, one of the origins of the quest that ends up in the so-called transcendental logic in Husserl is precisely the philosophical analysis of consciousness of internal time, the access and perception we may or not have of time's unfolding. If we accept as a main role for logic, providing an objective anchoring to our perceptions, mediated, modalized, filtered, and being a place of synthesis for all our noematic acts of knowledge, it is clear that a logical relation adapted to Fundierung necessarily has to account, among other things, for the way we access the effect of time, the way we perceive it. Husserl's analysis of time perception is immensely rich in examples, ideas, and layerings of these, contrasting memory of past events with intentionality, the way our thinking directs itself toward an event and effectively manages to interpolate between visible instances of those events. For instance, if I see my hand rotating, I may only perceive some of the states of this rotation, probably very few of them, but through intentionality, I may interpolate to a continuum of intermediate stages and see one rotating hand. I do not interpret it as a distinct object in each one of the moments I perceive through sight. This way of gluing or creating a synthesis is a crucial element of the analysis of time. Another crucial element connected with, but not reducible to, the previous is protension, the anticipation or bounded extrapolation of the movement or temporal event. This point has been much less analyzed mathematically. I expand on this point later. An immediate version of this protension is that, in some sense, I may extend my perception of time beyond. And this is very much what we're trying to do at this point in this conference. I overflow the perceived instant and anticipate that the hand will still be there, quote unquote, at least in a very close future. I anticipate, although in a very slight way. From these two elements, Husserl builds a network of time decomposition in a continuum of anticipations and interpolations, pretensions and intentionalities, extremely refined and irreducible to a merely analytic description. In an expanded way, this week has been an exercise in pretension and intentionality. There is really much more in transcendent logic than this description in Peircean terms. It involves temporality, it involves a stepping beyond language and direct objectuality, hence named transcendental of that logic. The scope of these notes does not cover the philosophical complexities of Husserl posits, almost in the style of mathematical problem for the coming decades, reformulated by Rota. The presence in our lives of a new void, a new emptiness, an inward turn, an internal close-up, an inner opening, bear witness to the importance of this idea. Our usual external bridges have been severed. Internal bridges have been somewhat brutally enhanced. So now we go back to perception. Before jumping to some final notions of what is beginning to happen and what some of us would like to happen after the end of the pandemic, even if such a notion is ever more undefined, ever more vague, here is a sample of emotions lived through as recorded in my personal blog, atsme.wordpress.com. So this will appear in images taken from the blog. Let me just describe what they are: intensity of dreams during the first weeks of confinement, the vivid awareness of inner time, of the Baroque volutes of the environment, dialogues, mental ones, with many people already departed, with many ideal friends, reading excerpts of Valéry, one of them on confinement, the texture of life, and dawns. So here is a picture of the blog, where there is an entrance of De las Barbas del Diablo, the Cortázar story read. Intensity of dreams at the beginning of confinement is recorded there. Also here, with some photographs of my, I was taking of my own confinement, cooking things, preparing. Maria Clara was preparing stuffed tukka flowers, and you can read if you want. Intensity of dreams at the beginning of confinement, making bread and looking at the volutes of plants. Again, intensity of dreams and perception of internal time and the, somehow Baroque volutes that are perhaps captured here. All these plants creating all these things. You start noticing all those knots, all these twisting shapes that you already saw. I mean, I had already noticed them before, but never in the same way. So I took these photographs. You can enlarge them if you want later. I just want to show. And let me read this. So, this is on the, no, but this is not what I wanted to read from Valéry. There is another one. Mental dialogues with many people who already left, with many ideal friends. Again, dreams and structure. There was a very strong feeling of structure being completely shattered in myself while this was happening. And this is un regard charitable. I read in French. Que de choses tu n'as même pas vues dans cette rue où tu passes 6 fois le jour, dans ta chambre où tu vis tant d'heures par jour. Regarde l'angle que fait cette arête de meuble avec le plan de la vitre. Il faut le reprendre au quelconque, au visible non vu, le sauver, lui donner ce que tu donnes par imitation, par insuffisance de ta sensibilité, au moindre paysage sublime, coucher au soleil, tempête marine ou à quelque œuvre du musée. Ce sont là des regards tout faits. Mais donne à ce pauvre, à ce coin, à cette heure, des choses insipides, et tu seras récompensé au centuple. The last sentences, yeah, you can watch many, landscapes, many places.
Andres seems to be gone.
It's gone quiet, yes.
Andres, you still there?
Can you hear us?
No, we've lost you, Andres.
We can hear you, but not Andres.
Something happened to Andres. Wait a second, because something happened with his Zoom. So, but he's coming back. I don't know. Maybe it was the connection, because when it gets slow, then Zoom kind of closes itself for some reason. Okay. Are you there?
Okay, can you hear me?
Now you're
Yes,
okay.
you can.
Okay.
Pero tienes que compartir la pantalla.
Okay. Can you hear un regard charitable?
Yes, we can.
So this is what I was reading, but let me just stop on the last couple of sentences. Many of what we watch normally are des regards tout faits, kind of a, pre-cooked, prepackaged ways of seeing. And he invites us to just look in your room where you spent so many hours. And now we spend so many hours, that poor corner, that time, and those, insipid things, these tasteless things, and you will be recompensed, you will be rewarded hundredfold. Tu seras récompensé au centuple. So again, texture of life, I was trying to capture with these photographs, texture of life. I don't know if in the small screen they can actually, mean something like that, but I was definitely, texture of a Zoom meeting with our friend Vanda. She appears in some of these photographs, texts of some other, this texture of life as it goes. And dawns, somehow I became extremely aware of dawns and the light at the beginning of the day. Now, projecting to the future, let me just bring this to a close with some possibilities. First of all, there is a duality between the inner and the outer that has always been there, of course, always, but somehow, in many ways, our, perception of inner, being completely confined, and at the same time being able to talk to people, as Margot Glantz was describing, seeing faces from the Balkans on the screen, and engaging in dialogue with several different people, some of whom we know since a long time ago, like Mirna, and some of whom we have just met this week. This is an incredible opening that is happening in spite of the closure. This has been discussed also here, but I think this sort of tension between internal and external is connected to this tension of logic and time, logic of time, and the question I described before. Periphery and center has been, ever since the very beginning of this conference, an extremely important point, and of course made ever more important by Yogendra Yadav's presentation. But in many ways, logic also has this sort of tension between classical logic and many other, many interesting logics there are. Confinement, closure versus opening. I already discussed this. There is a tension between logos and harmoton. So harmoton has to do with the way you are placed in it's the same root as harmony, the way you're placed, and logic has been partially flowing from logos to harmoton in what is my technical work in abstract elementary classes may be described along the tension between going from dependence on language to focusing on the way objects are placed in the world. And finally, fixed truth versus strong understanding of possible truths that also in part of my work, and certainly of other people who are here, like Mirna's work, it's called forcing. It's one of the manifestations of this, is something that is also very much at the core of what happens in logic. And I think it is a tool also to understand our own situations. So, gracias, merci, valati, thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrés. Thank you. So, the floor is open for questions and comments from anyone.
I would like to have a question, Andrés, about the final ideas about the logos harmoton dialectics. If you can expand a little more about that kind of important harmony for which mathematics is fundamental against the language, and perhaps the resurgence of the eidolon, of the images, and the dialectics and the fight, if you want, in your beginning words between logos and eidolon. How is it that related to harmony in mathematics? And particularly my question would be going afterwards. I think that the post-pandemic world will be not harmonious at all. This is my sense. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, these two questions are difficult. Let me just first describe a little bit more in detail what might happen. Of course, language has been there, ever since an extremely long time, and mapping the language to the world as we perceive it, and trying to find good mappings or better languages has been a quest that has been going on for many centuries. And I was just rereading Umberto Eco's La búsqueda de la lengua perfecta, the search for a perfect language, where he describes how the profusion of many languages is recorded in the Old Testament as a problem, because if you have many different languages, then which one is a good one? Is there a good? So of course Hebrew might have said, oh yeah, it is God's language, but some people started challenging that idea, and some people said, well, yeah, but you have better descriptions here, we have better descriptions of this there. As we have seen during this conference, there are things that are better said in English, and there are things that are better said in Spanish or in Serbo-Croat, but or in French. But this sort of there is a question of what comes first, language or what you want to describe. And one of the amazing things that happened in Schellach's, work in logic, among many amazing things that some people here have studied and know very well, was a shift. I don't know, I cannot really say how obvious that shift was to him when it happened in the 1970s, because it was gradual and it was convoluted, and as all the works of Schellach are, and extracting, all the consequences of that takes an enormous amount of work and time. But the shift was exactly looking, taking logic, which is the part of mathematics where language is most central, where language itself is a mathematical object that is studied, has been studied, one could say ever since Aristotle, but in the 20th century, it exploded with Gödel, and somehow turning it upside down. Of course, he doesn't describe it that way. He has some very nice descriptions a posteriori, and even in the beginning, in the 1970s. But what happens is, let's try to, instead of imposing a priori a language where you build a theory, you build a nice theory, you prove your theorems, this theory, and it is speaking about some object you're interested in, you start looking at the way objects fit one another. So fitting, harmoton is, harmoton, the original root is actually fitting, like when you put, cubes in a box. I mean, if you want to put cubes in a round box, they won't fit that well. Whereas if it is a square, like a cubic box or somehow rectangular, they will fit better. This kind of very, extremely naive idea is at the core of what we call elementary extension, and that is usually defined using language. What he does is invert. Let's look at the fitting first, and then, extract the consequences. And by the way, there will be a language, but language will be something that will come late. So this sort of putting forward the harmoton or the eidolon, as you say, is a very strange move, very delicate and extremely, it bears a lot of consequences. What is amazing is that you can extract so much logic, and that so many consequences that are usually thought of as depending directly on language. Well, they do depend on language, perhaps because there is language there, but in a kind of a twisted way where you can put the fitting in front. And that's something that I think is very, well, a posteriori, it feels very natural. I don't know if it felt, I think part of the mole theory community did not find it natural at all when it happened, because it took a long time to, sleep, and it is still on the way. By the way, I must say this fitting has a very geometrical and connects very well with some items coming from other parts of mathematics. Now to your second remark or question, how unharmonic our world will be. Yes, we have seen it this week, all this puzzlement, all this description of, this sense that I was trying to describe of unstructure. I used the word unstructure in the blog. I had forgotten about that, but this is somehow what is happening as well. My proposal is you have to somehow cling to this sort of shifts that happen, for instance, in logic, or as Margot Glantz was saying, should happen or are happening in literature, in poetry, like in Jan Swicky's description of think about the continental drift and think of epochs of that time span, in order to be saved somehow, in order to at least cling to something and have, I mean, it may not work at all. There's nobody, I think, has a magical key to a solution to this unharmony that is now descending upon us. Unfortunately, I cannot agree more, but this is perhaps the reason why I think it is crucial at this point to understand even more than ever, even more urgently than ever, something like Husserl's question of the logic, on the right logic of time perception, or the Harmoniton, eidolon versus language that you were mentioning. I don't know if this answers your question, but it is somehow along those lines that I think.
Perfectly well, thanks, Andrés.
May I mention something, Philip?
Yes, Myrna, please.
Yes. This is going to connect to the discussion of harmony and what's going to happen after. We are like survivors. And I think in our own lives, some of us lived through wars, some of us lived through catastrophes, terrorist attacks. Everybody has something that they've lived through. There is a film called Shoah that lasts 9 hours. That was made by Lanzmann. I can see that Philip knows it. He just interviewed people who managed to survive the Shoah. And it was interesting to see that there were several different reactions, but mostly they were polarized between two kinds of people. And one kind that I will mention are those who always smile. There is a man in the Shoah, maybe the second person that is interviewed, and he's always happy and he's always optimistic, and he tries to live the rest of his life as if nothing happened, because he understood the fragility of life. And then at one point he breaks. So I think we will have probably some deep, we are deeply blessed by what happened, even though it is nothing compared to the example that I took of the Shoah. But still, it is something that has hurt our inner workings. And I think whatever we do in the rest of our lives, these 2 months or 3 months, or for some of you even longer, they will never disappear, even if we try to laugh about them and pretend that they didn't exist. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is yeah. No, I had not thought about the connection to Lanzmann's Shoah movie. This is something that Maria Clara has explored quite a lot for her own work on landscape and the art, and she has a lot of things to say about Shoah. Lanzmann's Shoah. I've seen excerpts of it. It is very painful. I didn't know about the smile person who. That's a very, it's extremely strong, and in a way, perhaps we are, in a way, doing something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can say something. That is better. So what you are saying, Mirna, and what I'm thinking about what Andrés was talking, my point is about language. How language is, or how do we have the language to capture this moment, to capture the time and what is happening now? Because of course, Shoah's film is made after the events had passed. And there are many reconstructions of the event. There are many attempts to tell the story of the Holocaust, right? There are movies, documentaries, knowing the places, and photographs of what had happened. But what I think is really interesting is that history, in a way, evades. You cannot take it in a complete way. You need all the fragmentation to tell the story, to tell what happened. So my question at this moment is: do we have the tools? Do we have the language to speak of what is happening now? Are we able to capture it with the language that we have now? And I ask myself, is it going to change, as Margot Glantz was talking before about her way of writing? Is it going to change the way you construct, mathematics, or you think in your own mathematical problems? Is it going to change the logic in a way? So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's those are also two questions, and it's kind of for questions for thought for a long time. So first of all, I think the language is being now discovered exactly as we are doing this. It is a form of beginning to discover the language. In the case of Shoah, they really had much. They had to wait until the end of that. They could not. I mean, some people attempted actually to write diaries and so on in the concentration camps, but normally, either the people disappeared or the diaries, had to. They found in Poland some writings recently I saw of people who were recording what was going on, but of course it was impossible to survive. It now happens at a very different in a very different way, and I think building that language has is difficult, and it is partially what we are trying to do. When Mirna sent the invitation of this group of people to speak about these things, one could have thought, well, there are many people speaking about COVID-19. Of course, I mean, it's you have seminars, this and that, epidemiology, but this one here certainly had a different character, and I think it's one of the right places. Having here somebody like Margot Glantz or like Yogendra Yadav, just to mention two of them, they are providing tools to build a language, but it is in the process of being built. Now, as to how art or mathematics will change, I don't. This is we tend to continue on our own paths, a little bit like the smile that Mirna was mentioning, in our own mathematical doings. That may take perhaps longer, but perhaps it's a time also for awareness. There are new generations, our students, and they may come up actually with new, maybe the same questions, but maybe new ways of framing the same questions, and that already may start changing some of that. There was one question, but I think they sent it to me. Yeah, it's why do you mention nothingness at the beginning of your talk? What kind of nothingness are you referring to? I think it's a bad metaphor, but I like it somehow. So thinking of Esma's critique of using military and war terminology to speak about what we're going through. There is this thing that there is no another some neighboring country or some other population. It's not against a population in the traditional sense. It's not even against an animal like a bacteria or something like that. It's an entity that is pure information, the virus, and the fact that it is pure information almost it's almost like like a piece of your cell phone or something like that in some sense. Yet it is able to somehow go through the cell membranes and use your own information for its own purposes. But it's a very kind of intangible. It's this sort of intangibility that I was referring to. But also the fact that we don't really know how to, things, topics like such as the change in society and control of people or who the fuck is who, as was described. What are these entities? What is going on? There is all this kind of a lack of definition, perhaps, that made me use the word and that kind of, when I saw Cortázar's Las Varas del Diablo story, kind of clicked. Yes, it feels a little bit like some sort of emptiness that is trapping us. But we know it is information, and information is not emptiness. So it is in that sense that I say it's a bad metaphor.
I think there was a question for me about the other group in the Shoah. I'll just say this in one sentence. They feel guilty, the other group. They've survived. This is one of the major feelings about the people who survived Shoah. They ask, why me? Why is it me who was chosen? So, yeah, there are the feelings.
Yes. Okay, shall we draw that session to close and have a minute's break before the next talk? Okay. Thank you, Andres. That was really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you all.